You're watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. From Toronto, Ontario, this is Saamiyah Syed. Welcome back to the show. Now, coming up is an interview with Matthew Behrens on repatriating Canadians arbitrarily detained in Syria. But first, let's take a look at some headlines. 5 Indigenous leaders receive Order of Canada. Church rents space to Muslims for Friday prayers. Bring Abdul Home campaign at Toronto conference. Uyghur Muslim confirmed dead in East Turkestan prison. And now the details. 5 First Nations people are among this year's recipients of the Order of Canada. The Governor General has announced Thursday the 99 people who will receive the Order of Canada. Among these is Harry Laforme. He was Canada's first Indigenous court appellate judge, appointed in 2004. Laforme made a significant decision that led to same-sex marriages in Ontario. 1 year later, gay marriage became legal in Ontario. The Order of Canada is one of the highest honors in Canada. It identifies people across all divisions of society who made excellent and long-lasting contributions to Canadian society. Calgary Imam Syed says that Muslims in Okotoks finally have a location to pray Friday prayers. The Okotoks United Church agreed to rent a spot every Friday to the Muslim congregation. Muslims in Okotoks used to attend Friday prayers in South Calgary or High River. Some took an hour and a half to get there. Soharwardi led the first Friday prayer in December. Approximately 30 people prayed together. Soharwardi welcomes women and children to attend as well. He adds, quote, "The city might get its own mosque." The parents of a mentally ill young man imprisoned in the United States are asking people to thank the National Council of Canadian Muslims for highlighting his plight at the recent Reviving the Islamic Spirit conference in Toronto. Abdul Rahman al-Banasawi was sentenced in 2018 to 40 years for a bomb plot against Times Square in New York City. Most of it is in solitary confinement. The trial revealed medical expert opinion that his mental illness impaired his ability to think clearly. It also revealed he was entrapped by an FBI informant with the knowledge of the RCMP. The parents' campaign is to bring him back to Canada. Media reports are confirming that an Uyghur Muslim preacher died of liver cancer in a Chinese prison back in February. Omar Hussein was serving a 5-year prison sentence in East Turkestan. He was arrested for going on Hajj, the religious pilgrimage to Mecca, in September 2017. Hussein was a preacher in a mosque in Korla, East Turkestan's second largest city. He was transferred for, quote, re-education in 2017 when police officers altered temporary camp centers into prisons. Hussein was one of 4 brothers, ages 50 to 62, arrested by Chinese authorities for re-education since their religious practices were perceived as a security threat. And that's it for the news. Now, earlier in December, the federal court began to hear about the current Liberal government's refusal to repatriate 19 Canadian women and children who are being held in northeastern Syria. Joining us now to share more is Matthew Behrens from Stop Canadian Involvement in Torture and someone who attended the court hearings. Welcome to the show, and thank you so much for joining us today, Matthew.
Well, thank you for having me and for covering this very, very important issue.
Yes, definitely. Matthew, for some of us who are hearing of this issue for the first time, can you summarize the facts of the case?
Well, there's approximately 50 Canadians in total, over half of whom are children, who are currently detained under conditions that the United Nations calls akin to torture in northeast Syria. Many have been held anywhere from 3 to over 5 years. And the court case itself is based on the notion that the Canadian government has absolved itself of any responsibility to these Canadians to actually help bring them home. Their Kurdish captors have actually said, All we need is for the Canadian government to send a representative over, to sign the documentation, to issue the travel documents, and to return these Canadians to Canada. But unfortunately, for many years, the Canadian government, which in 2018 was within 1 week of actually bringing the Canadians home, actually stopped at that point. So we've been struggling through political lobbying, through back channel communications, through whatever we can do. And now we're in the federal court. And as you mentioned, we had 2 days of hearings in December, and we do have another one coming up on January the 6th to try and bring an end to what many human rights organizations, including the United Nations, Save the Children, Rights and Security, Reprieve, Human Rights Watch, have called a humanitarian catastrophe in which the lives of many thousands of human beings are literally wasting away, most of whom I think we can say are Muslim. And isn't it interesting, as usual, that Muslim lives are seen as expendable in the name of so-called national security imperatives?
Mm-hmm. Now, from what I understand, the hearings are regarding specifically 19 Canadians, but you mentioned that there are actually 50 or even more. Why is it that we're only focusing on those 19 then?
Well, there's currently 23 who are subject to, so there's 19 women and children and 4 men who are part of the BOLO lawsuit, BOLO meaning Bring Our Loved Ones Home. There are others who just were unable to sign up for or are difficult to communicate with. Some folks are afraid to be associated with any public action regarding this, given their fear of reprisals from the Canadian Security Intelligence Service or the RCMP. And so they're laying low. But nonetheless, if we do get a good positive court decision on repatriation, that would not only apply to the 23 Canadians who are named in this suit, but it should be able to apply to others. There's also an additional group of mothers who are non-Canadian citizens with Canadian husbands and Canadian children, and we're very concerned about their fate as well. The Canadian government should not be separating children from their mothers, especially when, for many of these children who are very young, under the age of 12, the only adult figure in their life is their mother. And the Canadian government is currently putting some of those mothers who are not Canadian citizens in the horrific position of having to say, you either keep them in these camps under conditions akin to torture, or you give them up to the Canadian custody and you stay behind, where you yourself might be subject to return to a country where you would face torture and further persecution.
Mm-hmm. Now, we hear about these people as numbers, but tell me about themselves. Who are they and why are they being withheld in these camps?
Well, many of the people in the camps are individuals who had gone to the region for a wide variety of reasons. Some of them were humanitarian workers. Some of them were women who were trafficked. Some of them actually went because they actually believed in this beautiful vision of what Daesh was allegedly promising. And then when they got there, they actually found out that it wasn't anything at all like they expected, but it was impossible to escape. And so with the fall of the caliphate, so-called, what happened is tens of thousands of people were thrown into these detention camps and have been held indefinitely since, arbitrarily and without charge. I'm working with one family that I was in touch with very recently. The male of the family had gone over as a scholar of Middle East history and of caliphates, and he was studying the region. He fell ill. He couldn't get out. His wife went in to try and rescue him. She met up with him, but she was stuck as well. So there's a notion often promulgated by the media that these are camps that are linked to so-called ISIS families, when in fact that nothing could be further from the truth. Yes, there are individuals within these camps who may have gone over, who may have been in ISIS-controlled territory, but let's not tar everyone with the same brush. And I think it's that same brush which has been used to defend Canada's position of refusing to repatriate everyone. I think the bottom line here is that individuals' human rights are being violated as children, as women, and as men in these horrific conditions. They are being arbitrarily detained when the Canadian government itself is a world leader in proclaiming we should never arbitrarily detain anyone, and that, as the Kurds themselves have urged, they should all be brought home to Canada.
Now, I want to pick up on something that you mentioned before, and I found this quote said directly by the government lawyers to a media source, and this says, quote, that there is no legal obligation under the Charter, statute, or international law for Canada to provide consular assistance, including the repatriation of its citizens. What is your reaction to this statement?
Well, again, this is the Canadian government just booting its responsibility down the road. We have a situation in which an ally of Canada, the administration of Northeast Syria in the war against ISIS, has begged and pleaded with Canada to come and get its citizens. These citizens have a right under Section 6 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms to be repatriated to Canada. And the Kurds are making it very easy for Canada to do this, but it's the Canadian government and its own Islamophobia and its recalcitrance who's refusing to do that. The Canadian government didn't say we don't have an obligation to Canadians detained abroad when the two Michaels were detained in China. The Canadian government did not say we don't have an obligation to repatriate Canadians when it brought back over 40,000 Canadians during a very difficult period at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, including bringing back Canadians who were in Syria at the time. So the Canadian government is very selective when it comes to who it allows as Canadian citizens detained abroad to actually have charter rights.
So now that this case is being heard in the federal court, what do we hope to get out of this?
What we hope is for the judge to, A, find that the rights of these Canadians have been violated by Canada's refusal to repatriate them, and B, we would like an order similar to an order that was issued about a dozen years ago in the case of another Canadian Muslim detained abroad, Abu Sufyan Abdul Razik, to be brought home, that the Canadian government must use the tools that it has available to either go directly and meet with the Kurds, or to appoint a third party, a non-governmental organization, or a special delegation who can go sign the documents, shake hands, do the photo op, and with the assistance likely of the Americans, who are very heavily invested in the area, bring everyone home. The judge at the last hearing was very concerned about this case. He said, we need to move expeditiously on this case because, as far as I can see, Canadians are either dying or at risk of dying. That's how serious this case is to the Federal Court of Canada. And we hope that with that seriousness, they say the only remedy is the one that has been recommended by most international human rights organizations, including the United Nations, which is repatriation.
And that said, how important is it that we work on this right away as a nation?
It's absolutely critical that we do this. You know, hundreds of children and women are dying in the camps every year. We don't even know whether all of the Canadian men are still alive in the prisons as well, because there's so little contact and there's very little communication from Global Affairs Canada with the family members of those who are detained as well. It's been very disturbing to see the silence of so many organizations who have bought the lies around who these detainees are. And ultimately, you know, even if there was a scintilla of truth to the allegations that may be made against some of these detainees, Canada has a judicial system, and individuals should be allowed to answer what those allegations are in an open, fair, and transparent process. But to date, no one has been charged. There's no real investigation that has gone on into whether or not they could be charged, as far as we are concerned. And ultimately, you know, like this 9-year-old Yusuf that I'm working with, he needs emergency brain surgery. Will he die on Canada's watch?
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Matthew, and for sharing some very important insight on this issue and, of course, what's to come.
Thanks so much.
You are watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. That's it from our Toronto studios tonight. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more Canadian Muslim content. Stay safe, and until next time.